Welcome, listeners. I'm Lawrence Yang. I'm a family doctor in Surrey, and I'm super excited today to introduce you guys to Dr. Jennifer Williams. Dr. Jennifer Williams, as far as I understand, you're a gastroenterologist in Vancouver Island. Is that right?
Yeah, so I used to say I'm a gastroenterologist in Nanaimo, and I'm actually the only gastroenterologist in Nanaimo, the first one they've had here. So now I am the gastroenterologist in Nanaimo, which always feels a little bit odd saying it that way, but that's the truth.
Wow. One specialist for a relatively large community.
Yeah.
So, wow. And it sounds like you had expected when you got to Nanaimo that your department might grow. You might have colleagues. Is that the truth?
Yeah, so I mean, that is the plan, right? So I have a big vision um, to create what's called my GI or Mid Island GI.
Mm,
Which would be a multidisciplinary clinic, really doing things in a different way.
mm,
It would be trauma informed, and it would be bringing people together to really build the belonging and then the healing, and then through that, the ongoing transformation to do things differently.
mm,
Being the only person here provides a lot of opportunities for sure. It also
mm,
provides a lot of challenges. But I do feel lucky to be here, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to
mm,
set things up in Nanaimo and build those relationships with family doctors, with our nursing colleagues, with health authorities, and with the community as well, to really look at how can we provide and build GI care based on the strengths that we have and identifying the gaps and really being able to fill in those gaps as well
mm.
to meet the needs of people in Nanaimo and surrounding area.
Now, I've been trying to pull you in to do this podcast for months now, like probably at least a year. I've been writing to you, trying to get you in. And I understand you're busy. You're the only GI doc for
Yeah.
the city of Nanaimo, which is, uh, that's probably where Nanaimo bars came from, eh? Nanaimo?
Well, there's debate over that. So it is named the Nanaimo bar, but I was reading an article recently that showed it should actually be the Port Alberni bar.
Okay.
It
This
was
is another.
the recipe was stolen.
Damn, some knowledge vampirism there.
Yes.
So I yeah, I've been trying. I'm so glad that you're here today. I'm going to stay in the present, and I'm just so glad. But the reason I was so stoked to speak to you is because you and I were on some psychological safety and physical safety committees in the provincial level. You representing the island, myself representing part of the Lower Mainland Fraser Health region, and every time I heard you speak about the safety challenges of working in the health system, I would get so much resonance. Like my spirit was like, yes, this person knows what's going on, and the way that you would speak, like every sentence you said, you were like hitting on these really core concepts that most people don't even have the language for. So I was like, I've got to learn more from Dr. Jennifer Williams, and so here you are. Um, where did you come up with your understanding of trauma informed practice and leadership? And you said sense of belonging. Like these are very these are concepts that are deep. I feel there's so much more to what belonging means to you, so much more to what leadership and what trauma informed practice. Where do you get your education from to be able to speak about it like this?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, I think it goes back to my journey as a human, right? We all have our journeys, which
Mhm.
start well before we ever get into medical school. Um, and then I think, our behaviors and what we do is really shaped by our experience at various points along the way. So I grew up in Newfoundland.
Okay.
I was born in a small town, moved into St. John's and grew up there. Um, and there was always a good sense of belonging. We were the underdogs in Canada. You might travel off the island for various things. People made fun of us. People didn't think we were very smart, but we were really good at building that sense of belonging and really supporting each other, right? Um,
Mm.
and then I think throughout, I approached medical school that way, residency, and then being a staff that way as well. In terms of, again, like that shared humanity piece
Mm.
of supporting each other, listening to each other, understanding, supporting each other when we're having a bad day, when there's a complication, whatever. Um, and I think the personal experience along the way hasn't always been positive.
Mm.
And I found myself, I remember when I had my second child, and
Mm.
I carted him up the stairs in his little, car seat, and I sat down with a counselor, a psychologist from the Physician and Family Support Program in Alberta, which is where I was before coming to Nanaimo. And I was burnt out, or what we would call burnout. I would call it something different now. Um, and she looked at me and she said, "Jen, I see these glimpses of this amazing, confident person, which I think you are. And then I see a shell of a
Mm.
person sitting in front of me."
Mm.
And so I really use that as a learning opportunity, um, to say, okay, how did I get here? What's going on that got me here? What can I do personally to build, my confidence, my resilience, my skills, those sorts of things, sort of to rebuild? Um, and what's going on in our culture, our environment that's driving this?
Mm.
Because there are so many people that are suffering from the symptoms of burnout, right? So, burnout is really an occupational hazard, and it's based on symptoms of exhaustion, including emotional exhaustion, depersonalization or cynicism, and decreased feeling of self efficacy. Um, and I think if we look at it from an upstream approach, it's actually the consequences of chronic workplace trauma repeatedly over and over again from working in these cultures where our experience has us constantly in some sort of a survival mode or trauma response. And so I really use that as a learning opportunity to build some of the knowledge. I did lots of leadership courses. So I did a leadership course through the Haskayne School of Business, combined with the School of Medicine in Calgary. I went to Stanford and completed the Chief Wellness Officer certification course.
Oh.
Um, I've held lots of advocacy and leadership roles, and I think most importantly, I've listened to other people. So I've listened to myself, and I've listened to other people. Um, and I think you know there's a lot of shared experiences, and potentially we're not in safe environments to be vulnerable to share them, or we're not in environments where we can actually acknowledge what's happening. Um, and instead, we end up developing blindness. Our bodies won't let us see what's happening. Our minds won't let us see because it's hurtful if we can't do anything. And so we often end up normalizing that.
Mm.
And that can create, I think, betrayal in our colleagues and friends as well. And so, yeah, I use it as a learning opportunity. And, I think the goal is really, how do we create shared common language around a lot of this?
Mm.
And so a colleague and I actually, we've developed a leadership framework,
Mm.
which I think really is the wellness strategy, the leadership strategy, and the system design strategy to shift us from trauma inducing places of work and cultures to trauma informed, and ultimately to what I've coined humanity centered healthcare and humanity centered systems.
I'm getting so much resonance right now that I'm getting emotional. It's amazing. I gotta breathe it out. Wow. Wow. So I want to hit back on something that I didn't fully capture. It was sometimes we choose because it's hard to look at. We we normalize traumatic the traumatic aspects of our workplaces. And then you said there was a connection to that to betrayal. Can you speak to that real quick?
Yeah, so I think, if we look at, what we've called burnout, I think is really, if we take an upstream approach to that, it's chronic repeated workplace trauma. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we experience a number of different traumas in our workplace. So there are certainly traumas we encounter by virtue of being healthcare professionals, right? So we do deal with death and dying. We deal with medical complaints. We deal with college complaints. There is an element of moral distress as we're in a strained system. Um, and then I think there's also the traumas we experience that really challenge our sense of belonging.
Mm.
And those are the cultural pieces. And I would put moral distress and moral injury or moral distress in there as well, because we can't always bring our full authentic selves to work if we're not in safe environments,
Mm.
if we're going to be penalized for things. And so that also is a trauma. There's also microaggressions that we experience on a cumulative basis. So each microaggression in and of itself may seem, small, but again, they have a cumulative impact. There's tokenism, where, particularly as physicians, we may have a seat at the table, but we're not really included. So we're given all of the responsibility, but none of the levers or none of the power to actually exert change or control over things. So we just end up taking on all the responsibility. Or as an example, maybe I'm, the one woman on a committee or something like that, thought to take on all the voices of women, but again, not really included there.
Mm.
There's also racism. Um, Traumas we experience by virtue of being in the healthcare profession. And then there's the traumas we experience by the culture that we're exposed to, that challenge our sense of belonging. In addition, there's another form of trauma we experience. It's called betrayal trauma or institutional betrayal. So that occurs when we as humans go to a person or organization, institution that we're supposed to trust, that are supposed to look after us, and we are dependent on in some way. And they break that trust and relationship, um, by when we go with a concern or trauma, we're not receiving the treatment we expect to receive, right? So we may be dismissed, we might be denied, we might be belittled in some way, we may be ignored, or we may be blamed. Um, and these are all forms of gaslighting, right? And they do break that relationship and break that trust because we experienced trauma. We went to a place where we were expecting to get some support and it was not met with that. That form of trauma is actually much more harmful. It's much more likely to be associated with negative and lasting impacts. And it's much more difficult to recover from because of that relational component and that trust piece. And I
Much more
think
difficult.
that's mhm,
Much more difficult than the trauma that we experience in the course of delivering care, like vicarious trauma.
exactly. Yeah. So that secondary trauma that happens as a result of not receiving the support and trust that we thought we would receive in those relationships is much more harmful and difficult to recover from because of that relational piece, right? So things that are more likely, traumas that are more likely to have a long lasting impact or negative impact, it's dependent on, the severity of the event itself, the cumulative nature, and then the presence or absence of mitigating factors. And the single biggest mitigating factor for trauma is what I would call humanity, but it's termed social reciprocity. So having another human being that you trust, that listens, that understands, that hears you, and that supports you.
Wow. So you kind of have the expectation of reciprocity in a particular culture, and then that culture actually shuts you down, or could you call it silencing? You called it silencing, or
Yeah, so they might again, organizations that are set up for institutional betrayal or betrayal trauma. I mean, they tend to have privilege that comes with it. So, membership requirements. Anyone that steps outside of that conformity sort of are brought back in or penalized as a means of, professionalism or self governance. There's also associated with that privilege prestige. So, leaders in those systems tend to have be thought of more highly in society. With that comes trust as well. It tends to be very difficult to report abuses of power for people holding power. And then priorities, right? So priorities of performance or maintaining reputation of the organization seem to outweigh the experiences of the people. So organizations that are more likely to be, to foster institutional betrayal or betrayal trauma tend to have those membership privileges some prestige, and then priorities. And those are really the same factors, which, if we reframe them, could actually be used to build that belonging. We're all in this together. We've gone through training together. We're supposed to be trusting one another. And how can we shift our priorities to really look at the experience of people, right? Not just providers and each other, but our patients as well.
So, is institutional betrayal, um, is it being excluded from a particular group, or is it about you can still be in the group, but we're not going to listen to you, or not validating your sufferings? Is there a difference there? Or?
So I think it could be both, right? So it may be exclusion. So one of the, simplest ways you can actually exclude someone is to gaslight them, right? Um, so to, uh, say you're listening, but you're not really, because you've twisted things, or to dismiss something that someone has said, right? So if someone speaks up at a meeting, and it's sort of dismissed or ignored, and then someone else takes that idea, runs with it, claims it is theirs, that is really a form of gaslighting and exclusion. It's a form of bias as well. And if you're exposed to that repeatedly, or even just once, it could be betrayal, right? Because maybe you brought something up, maybe it took courage to say that, it was dismissed, somebody else says it, it gets twisted where, you feel shame or blame for bringing it up. And then it wasn't met with listening, understanding, or action, right? The other thing institutional betrayal could be is, there's actions, there's also inactions, right? So failing to have a proper system to report concerns of safety can be a form of institutional betrayal.
Mm. Yes. Yeah. So systems that are poorly designed,
Yeah.
poorly designed system can be institutional betrayal, because it shows a lack of concern for
Yeah.
maybe safety. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
It's interesting you bring that up about design, right? Because if we think about what are our systems designed to do, right? There's that saying, the famous quote, "Every system is perfectly designed for the outcomes that it achieves." So what's our system designed to do, right? And I think our system's broken, and our system's not broken because it stopped doing what it was designed to do. Our system is broken because it was inflexible and it continued to do exactly what it's designed to do. And
Yeah.
I think it's designed to silence into compliance and keep people into conformity. And that's no longer what we need or what we want.
Yeah. By all the claims, that is what the system is designed to
Hmm.
do. At the same time, it does deliver some care to some
Hmm.
folks,
Hmm.
and it does serve the needs of some folks. But
Yeah.
there's a growing, maybe growing majority who are not happy with our system design,
Hmm.
on the health professional side as well as on the patient side. So you're right, the system is not serving our patients. And sometimes when I think about redesigning systems so that they can improve how they meet the needs of everyone, I think I get overwhelmed. I think that
Hmm.
it's going to take too much customization to design something that meets the needs of everybody.
Hmm.
And so I give up. So,
Hmm.
so I'm like, oh, I'm just going to walk away, let somebody else try to do system redesign. But
But I think you're doing it every day, right? And I think, you know, um, I think healthcare providers are doing it every day because we find workarounds, right? We find workarounds, which ends up being exhausting. Um, but I think we are doing that because when you see patients one on one, you care for you care with your patients. You try and do the best that you can, and you try and advocate and be an ally with that patient, um, the best that we can. And it does become exhausting. And I think, we're seeing that, right? There's record levels of, again, what we've called burnout, those symptoms of exhaustion, cynicism and depersonalization. But if we put that into a trauma informed lens and view that in terms of trauma, this is an occupational hazard that we need to address, because when we're in our trauma brains as providers, we can't see past our own nose, right? We lose our ability to actually feel empathy for other people. We lose the ability to take that perspective from other people. And we become exhausted. We have brain fog. And if we don't feel cared for, if we don't feel that sense of belonging, how can we care for other people?
Yeah. And as you said, so many of us have normalized
Yeah,
these very unhealthy situations, and we've decided that this is just what you need to tolerate to be in
yeah,
this business of being a physician or being a nurse. And of course, that only lasts for so long until our bodies say no.
yeah,
And then you decide, you know what, fuck it, I'm leaving this place. I'm
yeah,
not going to be in
yeah,
this work anymore, and I'm going to exit and find another career. I don't know, real
yeah,
estate or something else.
yeah,
Uh, and then here we are, 2024. Not enough workers to fill a shift. Not enough nurses. Not enough doctors to fill to meet the needs of anybody. And no saviors in sight. There's
yeah,
nowhere in the world that we can recruit enough folks to tolerate the toxicity that we have in our workplaces.
yeah,
So we're left with doing the best we can with what we have currently.
yeah.
And I feel like your team, who's built some type of leadership training curriculum, that might give us an edge. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the goal. So myself and Jody Ploquan. So Jody is she's still in the physician experience portfolio at Alberta Health Services, and we met there when we were working there together prior to me moving to BC. And the goal is really, how do we create what we had called at that point trauma informed workplaces? So, extending trauma informed care to patients, extending that to leadership, and leadership as a way of being in terms of how we interact with each other, so we can create really trauma informed workplaces. So, the same type of care and listening, compassion, and avoidance of harm we would show our patients, we really do that with each other. So, how do we weave that humanity or leadership as a way of being into our interactions with patients, with each other, on our teams, into our organizations, and into our policies, procedures, and protocols? And that really becomes, how do we build humanity centered systems and organizations? And it really is based on that leadership as a way of being. So, the mnemonic or the framework we've come up with is called safer leadership or safer interactions. And each of the letters stands for something different. So the S is safety. So physiologic safety, as per Ford's polyvagal theory, physical safety, psychological safety, and cultural safety. The A is really about awareness. So, awareness of trauma and how it shows up in ourselves, in patients, in each other, our teams, and how it's embedded into our organizations. And it's really about understanding the impacts of that trauma. It's also about acknowledgement. So, acknowledging the harms that have been done, acknowledging that we are working in trauma inducing systems by design, quickly followed by a commitment to do better and to actually transform, and then action. It's also about assessment, right? We will change what we care enough about to measure. What are we measuring? How do we shift from performance metrics to true quality metrics, to look at the quality of the experience, so the quality of the environment and the quality of the relationships, right? So just looking at data and numbers, that generates stats. If we actually look at the experience of people, that generates empathy. And empathy is the most powerful human emotion or feeling for revolution and change. right? You get to compassion. You can only get there if you go through empathy. It's also, the A is also about avoiding institutional betrayal or avoiding betrayal trauma. So mindfully avoiding further hurt or harm. F is about fostering voice and choice. So it's really, what's your strengths-based empowerment strategy? How do you empower frontline leaders? How do you give voice and choice to patients? How do we enhance influence for the people on the front lines? We know there was a study out of the UK. It was based on pre-COVID information, but they basically showed that leaders that show that they care about people in their unit and enhance influence, saying, you know, what's going well here? What can we do differently? How do you think we should do things on a day-to-day basis? So increasing that influence is associated with a decreased perception of workload and overall increased patient satisfaction and quality and care. So that's your F, so fostering voice and choice. E is about embracing compassionate curiosity. So shifting from a judgment mindset to a curiosity mindset. So instead of looking at people as what's wrong with you, what happened to you? What's going on inside you? And it's really about courage as well. So having the courage to stand up and speak out and having the courage to sit down and listen. So it's really about reframing discomfort. Instead of meeting discomfort with defensiveness and shifting blame and accountability, it's really expecting, embracing, and exploring the discomfort. So that's my job, where I'm uncomfortable most of the time. So I have to look at why, right? So that's really about your E, is embracing that compassionate or courageous compassion and curiosity. And then R is about restorative connections. So it's really about relationships. It's really about building that sense of belonging and building that trust. So when Jody and I created this framework, we had the opportunities to do some training in restorative practices, restorative justice, and peacemaking circles. And this is all based on Indigenous practices from around the world, which has worked for generations. So it's really about recognizing it's the loss of the relationship or the break in trust that's broken. And so how do we go about repairing that? And I think trust levels have been and continue to be at an all-time low. So how do we build or rebuild that trust? And then how do we build that connection? The single biggest predictor of early death and mortality is loneliness or loss of connection. The UK has said there's an epidemic in loneliness, and they actually have a minister for loneliness. We know that relationships that are destined to fail are the ones where one partner in the relationship wants to talk about things and make improvements, and the other wants to sort of, brush it under the table or dismiss it. We know that relationships that are destined for success or more likely to be successful are the ones where there's, 5 positives for every 1 negative. So if we look at, what is our system based on? Is it time to actually look at how do we redefine the relationships? Because I think the relationships we're in, often with our organizations or with government, are coercive control at best. So can we take some of these restorative practices and really bring people together to understand what's our system based on? What are our relationships based on? What's the impact of that? And what's the path forward together? So can we take some of that science that we know about relationships and belonging and trust and bring that to all of our systems, knowing they're all interconnected, to really redefine those relationships and start a new path forward?
Wow. Framework makes so much sense. It sounds logical. It also sounds challenging. It sounds lofty. But it has to start. It has to start somewhere. It has to start with, like any innovation, there are going to be early adopters and there's going to be laggards. There are going to be people who are like, the system works as it is and I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing. But I think you're going to have a lot of people who are very interested in this.
It's interesting, right? Because humans, we know we're hardwired to connect. That's how our brains are developed. We are wired to connect, and we thrive in environments where we're seen and we're heard and we're understood. and we have opportunities for growth and develop, which means we have opportunity to mess up, right? And there's still going to be someone there in our corner, and we can recover from that. And I would say, what are our systems designed to do? What are our systems wired for? Right. So one of the slides I have in presentations I do is entitled, "Our regulatory systems are dysregulating our people." And that's a
Mhm.
problem, right? So all of us have this in us to give. This is how we're wired, to connect with other people, to be human, right? To practice that humanity. I am because we are. And in the Maori culture, the word for leadership, and I may get the pronunciation wrong, I apologize. I think it's rangatira, and so it's really two words coming together. It means weaving people together.
Wow.
And I think that's leadership, that's humanity, that's what we're wired to do, right? We're wired to widen our windows of tolerance.
Mhm.
And when people experience something really bad or really good, to meet people where they're at and to
Yeah.
listen and to be allies and to really be leaders as a way of being.
This sounds so ideal, Jennifer, and it sounds like it requires an openness to a spiritual way of being, an openness that goes beyond um, the constructs that have in recent history come to define corporatized medicine. Um, it is absolutely this the culture that you're describing feels contrary to capitalist principles of production and of it seems counter to colonial approaches of grabbing what resources we can while we can and then get out and leave whatever's behind. It sounds like this approach to leadership, the safer approach to leadership, it takes into consideration a holistic view of communities and teams and of humanity. It sounds like you're aiming for sustainability and a very disruptive approach to organizing medicine and service delivery.
Yeah.
It,
Um,
it sounds like
I would say
slow.
it's
It sounds slow. It sounds like it's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like I always used to say disruptive, and I should be a chief disruption officer. There is such a thing.
Yeah.
There's a chief experience empowerment, well, no one has this. This is what I think leadership is: chief disruption, empowerment, and experience officer. I don't like the words chief or officer, but that's really what leadership is, right? So
Mm,
listening to understanding the experiences to empower people and community, um, empowering, and you're basically empowering to create action, and you're empowering action to disrupt the status quo. But this is really, rather than disruptive, it's transformational. And I think by tapping into the humanity and focusing on putting that belonging and humanity at the center of what we do, of what we're doing, really builds that belonging. And it's that belonging and coming together of people and humanity that builds the healing that I think we need if we're suffering from various sources of trauma. And it's really that belonging and healing and creating that and embedding it into our systems that actually creates the ongoing transformation. So it's not like you get to the end point. This is ongoing. It's constantly evolving. And it really is a paradigm shift, right? So it's a paradigm shift from trauma inducing um, cultures and systems to trauma informed, and then to humanity centered systems and organizations. And that comes by weaving humanity through the interactions and, teams and policies, procedures, and protocols. And it's shifting from having no awareness of trauma or being harmful to really having trauma informed practices embedded and polyvagal practices embedded into what we do. It's shifting from, like you said, colonized models to, some have called restorative models or indigenized models. So you're shifting from power over to power with. You're going from done to actually co creating and empowerment. You're shifting from a reactive downstream approach to an upstream and proactive approach. And you're shifting from directive styles of leadership or management to really relational styles where you put that relationship and building trust and understanding the experience at the core. And I think that's really where we need to go, right? Recognizing that all things and people are really related and connected. And it's also about going from more individual, like self-actualization of the individual to more collective models as well. And then finally, I think going from power and privilege or equality through equity, diversity, and inclusion, and then ultimately to building that belonging, the allyship, and justice.
Wow. I think there are those who I think maybe they just don't believe that this ideal future could possibly exist. There are those who say that that's great, Jennifer. This is a great in your bubble world wherever you are. That sounds great. But currently, like there's always going to be those who are not included and shouldn't be included in our circle and stuff like that. What do we do? What do we do about people with those types of narratives? We just ignore them, right? And then we do the best we can, and then hopefully they get pulled in and transformed in the end.
Well, I think I want to look at where those narratives come from, right? So I mean, there's different trauma responses. So hurt people hurt people. So how do we go from hurt people hurting people to healing and transforming people, healing and transforming, right? Because it's a constant journey. So I'd want to know, like, I'd want to understand those statements, what they're grounded in, what they're rooted in. Is it a trauma response in some way? Um, and, start those dialogues and conversations, right? There is lots of data out there, um, and everything that I've talked about in terms of the benefits of having environments like this for humans. Um, I think there's lots of data, from the adverse child event score and the positive child events as well, which is actually leadership, in terms of how this can actually help create those, you've called sustainable systems. I don't know if it's sustainable systems anymore. People have started to use the term regenerative systems. Maybe it's ongoing transformative systems. I don't know. That those things are coming out. I don't know. Maybe there's other data that I haven't read that I'm certainly happy to learn about as well. But I think it starts with listening.
If I was to presume, it was because those who share those narratives have tried before to shift paradigms and have had traumatic experiences of their dreams being crushed.
Yeah.
And to protect themselves, they've stopped believing that different is possible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they want to pull you into that to stop believing.
Yeah.
So that they can be right. So that they
Yeah.
can be right, nothing can change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you know what? If that's the situation, I think in most courses I've been at, we're taught like the actively disengaged that are sort of undermining the process. I think in many situations, those are some of your best leaders. And like you said, they've been betrayed and their trust is low. And so they actively disengage as a survival or trauma response, right? If if you can re-empower the disempowered, and because I think those are the people that fluctuate between visionary, great leader, and sort of actively disengaged, potentially undermining the process. And they know a lot, right? Like they can do that. But if we can actively re-empower the disempowered and create that critical mass, leaders, of visionaries, of what was it, the tipping point, right? So if you can bring the mavens, the connectors, and the salespeople together by actively re-empowering the disempowered, you get your critical mass to actually really see transformational change. That's how I think you
Mm,
do it. I think you pull in that, you identify the actively disempowered. We want you. We want to hear from you. You have great ideas. I
mhm,
think those are your natural leaders, and they probably also oscillate between actively disengaging and sort of visionary. Bring them back over, re-empower, and I think that's how you get your critical mass to actually start to see some real transformational change.
mhm. I think you're spot on. And I think it takes a wonderful, skilled leader to re-engage someone who's been hurt, someone who
Yep.
is trauma and resiliency informed, to create the space for that connection and to rebuild that trust. Someone who's authentic, someone who's empathic, and someone who's very logical with the data.
Yeah. And
If
first we have to recognize it, right? That it could actually it could actually be a trauma response. And to have the courage to listen.
it almost always is, where does someone acquire the wisdom that you have? I know some of it was through lived experience, and that's challenging to pass on. But we look forward to your book. Uh, so, and but but there are probably some mentors and some leaders and some courses. You mentioned one of them was the Stanford Chief Wellness Officer course. The other one was through Cascades University, where there was a something there. There was like a medical school involvement. What are some of those resources that you might share with the listeners now if they wanted to do their own study?
Um, I think it's interesting, right? Because I think whenever we do training, you have to take your lens to it. So when we talk about leadership training, is it actually leadership that we're training? Um, is it the type of leadership that we need to shift things, right? So what do I mean by that? Um, so we know, so from the adverse child experiences literature, we know that positive childhood experiences are the single biggest mitigating factor for negative outcomes long term into adulthood for adverse child events. So those are things like having at least two non-parent adults that are in your corner that support you, being in safe environments where you can talk about feelings, um, having pride in culture, having a good friend group. So it's really about building that belonging and having people you can speak with. That's leadership, right? It's having an ally, at least two. That's leadership. If you transfer that to adult world. Steve Swenson and Tate Shanafelt, when Tate was still at Mayo, they developed a leadership behavior index. So there was 5 leadership behaviors, and they came up with a scoring survey. So for every 1 point increase I give you as my leader on these 5 behaviors, my risk of burnout goes down by 3.3% for every 1 point increase. And my overall professional fulfillment goes up by 9%. Okay. And they
Wow.
actually found that the biggest factor in terms of the difference in burnout or wellness fulfillment scores between units had to do with these leadership behaviors. And the 5 behaviors that they looked at as being important were my leader includes, informs, inquires, recognizes my strengths and skills, and develops.
Wow.
Um, they also found that my leader cares about me. So feeling cared for was the single biggest predictor for someone staying in their workplace rather than leaving. So they actually do stay interviews, not exit interviews, stay interviews. They do exit interviews as well, but they do stay interviews. So what can we do to keep you happy here? How are things going? All those sorts of things. We also know having a best friend at work or a friend at work is also a significant mitigating factor for burnout. So think about those things, right? So includes, informs, inquires, recognizes, and develops, cares about me, building belonging based on what we know from positive childhood experience data. Is that what we're training leaders to do? Is that what's in contracts for leadership positions?
Mm.
Right? So Tate Shanafelt and colleagues took it a step farther when he went to Stanford, and they looked at the sleep patterns of their leaders and their burnout scores and fulfillment scores for leaders, and then they looked at people on their team. And so if I, as a leader, have a lower burnout score, higher fulfillment score, better sleep score, people on my team also have the same. So we actually really regulate each other into this, window of tolerance or state of thriving, right? So our experience is really determined by our environments. So our physical environments, our psychological environments, and the relationships in those environments as well. And so how can we foster that? And I think that's really what leadership is, right? Weaving people together. It's about being an ally, standing with, listening, supporting, recognizing, avoiding betrayal trauma. And that will really widen that window of tolerance. So we're less likely to find ourselves stuck in some sort of a, survival or trauma response.
Wow. If I had leaders in my organization that brought those skills and that awareness with them, I would want to pay them a lot of money. But we're talking about a shift where almost everyone maybe is increasing their awareness around these skills of being, these ways of being. There's not enough funds to go around. I'm getting stuck in some scarcity here, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but maybe I don't need to think about that. Maybe I just need to start. Maybe I just need to
I mean,
start myself.
yeah, I mean, I think you are, right? Like I think you're doing this. I think we all do this when we talk to patients, right? So we know the value of organizations that action trauma informed care. We know the value of compassion in healthcare. How do we extend that to each other? How do we embed that in our policies and procedures and protocols, right? So how do we show we care, and how do we prevent harm, right? So that's really what our safer leadership model is about. How do we show we care? How do we prevent harm? And how do we become comfortable with discomfort um, as well? I think is another big one. Um, but we all have this in us to give, right? This is what it means to be human, and it's messy. It's messy, right? We're gonna mess up. That's also, we have to embrace that. But we can all do this, and I think there's enough data and enough studies out there to show the benefits of doing this. And
Mm.
so now the key is, okay, how do we actually move this forward? So, I think it'd be nice to get some pilot projects. I'm hopeful that my GI, Mid Island GI, might be able to be a pilot project for having a comprehensive kind of metric or dashboard for measuring things that we currently don't typically measure, but looking at what's the provider experience? How does that align with the patient experience? How does that align with some of the true quality metrics that we can pull out in gastroenterology? And how does that pull out with some of the cost metrics as well?
Mm.
Right?
I don't
So
know if
can
you
we
noticed,
show
but
that? Yeah,
yeah, there's the
behind
cost
you. Yeah.
metric, there's the patient experience and the provider experience. Yeah,
Yeah.
very cool. Yeah, I'm excited for that. I hope to see that happen very soon. Was there anything else you wanted to add today for the audience?
I don't know what, yeah, you keep going back to, what about the naysayers? And this is a very ideal state and those sorts of things. Um, I guess it's, part of it is how do we meet people where they're at? Um, how do we create common language, shared language around these things? Um, what do you think are going to be the enablers and barriers? Do you have hope that this is possible?
I do.
And how do you think we do that?
I do. I do think that I do have hope. I do have hope. It just makes sense to me. It resonates so much with me, everything you say. And I think that, and I'm in, it is interesting. I note that I asked you what training should these folks go to learn more, and you said no training has this yet. And and I want to agree with you. I want to agree with you that that's mostly true, especially in the health professional space. That the leadership training that is humanitarian is very, very hard to find. Um, so the way forward is to build that common language. The concepts that you've used today in this podcast, things like trauma informed, things like institutional betrayal, like betrayal trauma, um, things like window of tolerance. Um, these are loaded terms, which each could come with an hour or so of of exploration. So this glossary of terms, this nomenclature, if you want, it needs to be almost experientially learned by each of these leaders who are coming up. And no, people don't have to have it all. No one can be, not everybody can be Jennifer. But we can find which parts of this language really resonates with us, and then we develop that, and we lean in with our strengths to be a part of this changing tide, this transformation of health professional culture. So I think that's just how it goes. We meet people where they're at, like you said. We encourage and invite, and we continually invite and include people to join in on this movement of compassionate humanitarian leadership. Um, I think that's just how it works, and I think it's through mediums like this where we expand the awareness of what is possible, and those pilot projects with the metrics that we can generate with that to kind of see what we can do. One of the challenges with pilots, of course, is that you have very small, limited resources often. And because no clinic is on an island, the interactivity between different nodes in the network will impact the performance and the metrics that you get within that silo. And so I see that as a continued challenge as well, that you can optimize one silo, but other silos that connect to it can impact your metrics. And we know that through interaction between nodes in the network. So there's a lot of complexity science that we need to involve when we make
Yeah.
transformations like this. The leadership style that you have shared with us in this past 30, 40 minutes is a transformational style of leadership that is not easy to just academically absorb. Um, it's something that requires inner work. It requires, for some of us, reparenting of ourselves, and so it's not out of reach, but it's something that we need to be patient about, and that we need to walk with a lot of folks as they go on this journey of understanding what is actually possible, and as they expand their vision of what is possible. I can see that you have it. I can see you, Jennifer, that you have the vision of what's possible. I mean, there's no other way you could speak so clearly about it, is because you see it. But I really hope
Yeah.
that more people can see it. Mhm.
And I think it is, like you said, it's a movement, right? This is really a movement. If you
Yes.
can create and identify what my colleague would call positive deviant units that are doing things differently but are getting better outcomes. If you can then look at, well, how do we measure these things, right? So my PQI project this year is called Humanity, the Missing Quality Indicator. So
Wow.
how do we start to measure some humanity? Um, and then if we can identify groups that are doing things differently, we have some data to go along with that. Then I think you create this movement, because I think teams, units want to do it. So you get some support at the executive level, you get this grassroots movement where you can share successes and challenges, and then you get this just a movement, right? It's kind of like that lone nut video where one person is dancing, makes it look easy, everyone joins in, and you create this movement. One of the groups that we created, so we brought people together, it was about 2 years ago now, talking about the current state of healthcare, the current state of providers in the system, and how really, if we want to improve the experience for patients and create, some sort of a sustainable, transformative system, we really, really need to look at, again, that shared humanity piece. And we kept coming back to, again, humanity. And so the group that we landed on was called Empowering Hope, where hope is all capitalized. So it's really empowering, humanizing your humanity to optimize the person experience, with person being the provider, patient, public, politician, and really the planet, right? When you look at it from a humanity-centered focus as well. So this is also about planetary health. And I think it's a movement of hope. So as we start to see these shifts, in terms of, where to get some of this training. So, Jody and I brought this together and put it into a framework. We do offer sessions. So we've got a 2-day leadership course that we offer through the Canadian Medical Association. We can also do 3-hour workshops as a bit of an introduction. So then groups and teams can look at what this looks like for their team, right? So they can inspire that vision, empower the community, and then really transform at the speed of relationships and belonging and trust. So we do that. And then, I'll do 20-minute talks, 15-minute talks, half-hour talks, hour and a half, meet with people, meet with teams as well, just to try and get some of this out there, because it is really transformational, but it makes sense, right? And I think when we sit with people and talk about it, they say, oh, wow, it really makes sense. And so if we can do it in some organized ways and, celebrate those successes and challenges, then you can really, other groups can take it and run with it, knowing it's going to look different in each community, right? Because you have different strengths, different needs, different gaps, different experiences.
So if any of the listeners out there want to learn more, they want to connect with you or Jody, what's the best way that they can connect with you? Do you guys have a website? Do you have a LinkedIn, or do you have just an email address?
So my email address would be the best way to connect right now. And then, I can connect people if they're looking through an offering through the CMA, I can connect them that way. And so my email address is drjen, JENN, Williams @gmail.com.
So
And
that's,
so,
yeah, that's drjenn Williams @hotmail.com.
gmail.com.
Oh my gosh, @gmail.com.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So Dr. Jen Williams @gmail.com.
Dr. Jen with 2 N's.
Yeah.
Dr. Jen Williams @gmail.com. Perfect.
Yeah.
No one uses Hotmail anymore. Sorry to those who do. Yeah, everybody uses email. So great. Dr. Jen Williams @gmail.com with 2 N's.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jennifer. And I know that we're going to be chatting again soon.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I always love chatting about this stuff, and I love chatting with you. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
It's an honor.